Little girl screamed, "Don't touch that food," Korean Mafia Boss shocked when he finds out why. Kang Tae-hyun lowered the fork slowly, the silver clinking against the fine bone china with a sound like a funeral bell. He didn't look at the girl yet. Instead, his gaze swept over the private dining room of the Black Dragon. This was his world, a fortress of mahogany, velvet, and bulletproof glass. Every inch of the space screamed of a man who had won the war for Seoul streets, yet as the silence stretched, the opulence felt suffocating. It was a golden cage, meticulously designed to keep the world out and his secrets in. For Tae-hyun, luxury had never been about comfort, it was about distance. The $10,000 suits acted as armor, and the heavy gold chain was a weight that reminded him of the lives he had stepped over to sit at this table. He lived in a world of absolute obedience where men like Min Jae and Do Yoon were paid to be extensions of his own will, not friends. He realized, with a sudden, bitter clarity, that he couldn't remember the last time someone had spoken to him without calculating what they could gain from the interaction. He was the most powerful man in the city, and yet, he was utterly alone. He looked at the wine in his glass, dark and expensive, reflecting the flickering candlelight. To the outside world, this was the dream, the ultimate success. But Tae-hyun knew the truth. His life was a series of cold rooms and guarded entrances. He ate alone even when surrounded by people. He slept with a pistol on his nightstand and a heart that had long since turned to stone to survive the betrayals of his youth. The isolation was a price he had paid willingly, but tonight, staring at the raw, unfiltered terror on the little girl's face, the walls of his cage felt like they were closing in. Seo-yeol stood there, her small chest heaving, a stark contrast to the sterile perfection of the room. She was the only thing in his life that wasn't polished, planned, or bought. As his bodyguards shifted impatiently, their leather holsters creaking in the stillness, Tae-hyun felt a strange, forgotten ache. This child hadn't come for money or a favor. She had walked into the dragon's den with nothing but a sack of poisoned scraps and a heart full of empathy for a man who didn't deserve it. The cold isolation that had been his strength for 20 years suddenly felt like a weakness. He realized that in his quest to be untouchable, he had become unreachable. He had built an empire, but he had lost his soul in the process. He looked at the girl, really looked at her. And for the first time in a decade, the dragon felt the cold wind of reality blowing through the cracks of his golden cage. The contrast was so sharp it felt like a physical wound. Under the warm, amber glow of the crystal chandeliers, the dining room was a sea of deep blacks and polished whites. Min Jae and Do Yoon stood as twin pillars of modern power, their tailored suits fitting them with military precision, the fabric expensive enough to feed a family for a year. They were the peak of urban sophistication, cold and efficient, their earpieces glinting like silver beetles. And then there was Seo-yeol. She looked as though she had been dragged out of a different century and discarded onto the marble floor. Her hanbok-inspired dress, once perhaps a vibrant ivory, was now the color of wet ash. The sleeves were frayed into thin ribbons of silk, and the hem was caked with the dark, oily mud of the fish markets. She was so small that the shadows of the bodyguard seemed to swallow her whole. In this room full of men who traded in millions, she carried her entire world in a rough, burlap sack, a heavy, stained thing that she gripped with knuckles turned white from the cold. I said, "Stay back." Min Jae barked, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. He took a predatory step forward, his polished leather shoe stopping inches from the girl's tattered cloth slippers. The girl didn't flinch away from the man, she flinched toward the table, her eyes locked on Tae-hyun's plate as if it were a coiled viper. "Please," she rasped, her voice cracking with a desperation that bypassed the bodyguards and struck Tae-hyun directly. The man with the cold eyes. He gave it to me. He said it was a gift for the hungry. She hiked the sack higher on her shoulder, the coarse fabric scratching against her neck. The smell of the docks, salt, rot, and cheap charcoal, began to drift through the scent of expensive truffles and aged wine. It was a smell Tae-hyun hadn't encountered in years, a smell that belonged to the gutters he thought he had escaped. Duyun reached out to grab her arm, his face a mask of professional stoicism, but Taehyun's hand shot out, catching his bodyguard's wrist in a grip of iron. "Don't," Taehyun commanded. He didn't look at his men. He looked at the girl's face. The dirt streaked across her cheeks, the messy hair tied with a piece of common twine, and the sheer, agonizing honesty in her expression. In a room full of expensive lies and tailored deceits, her rags were the only thing that felt real. The dragon was staring at a mirror of his own past, and for the first time, he felt the weight of his gold chain not as a trophy, but as a burden. Taehyun leaned forward, the heavy gold chain around his neck clinking against the edge of the mahogany table. He ignored the twitching hand of Duyun, who still hovered near his weapon, and focused entirely on the trembling child. The room was so silent that the rhythmic dripping of rainwater from Seo-yeol's frayed sleeves sounded like a ticking clock. "Tell me about this man," Taehyun said, his voice dropping to a gravelly, dangerous velvet. "The one with the cold eyes. What else did you see?" Seo-yeol swallowed hard, her small fingers digging into the rough burlap of her sack. He was tall. Like a shadow. He wore a dark coat, but his hands were what I remember. When he reached out to give me the food, his sleeve pulled back. She mimicked the motion, pointing to the base of her own thumb. There was a scar. It looked like a jagged lightning bolt, right here. And he had a habit of rubbing his ring, a heavy silver band with a cracked blue stone. The air in the room seemed to vanish. Taehyun's heart, usually a steady, frozen engine, hammered once against his ribs. He knew that scar. He had been there the night it happened, 15 years ago, in a rain-slicked alleyway in Busan. They had been brothers in all but blood, rising through the ranks until a botched shipment led to a car plunging off a pier. Taehyun had watched the black water swallow the vehicle. He had seen the funeral. He had even paid for the headstone of his former partner, Junho. And his eyes? Taehyun pressed, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the table. "They weren't like yours," Seo-yeol whispered, her voice shaking. "Your eyes are angry, but his were empty. Like looking into a deep well with no bottom." He smiled at me, but the smile didn't reach his face. He told me to eat well because it would be a long sleep. A chill that had nothing to do with the restaurant's air conditioning swept over Taehyun. The blue stone. The lightning bolt scar. The long sleep. These weren't details a street child could invent. Junho wasn't just a ghost, he was a hunter who had spent 15 years in the dark, learning Taehyun's every move, every preference, and every weakness. Taehyun looked at the plate of Hanwoo beef. It was no longer a meal, it was a message. His oldest friend hadn't just come back to kill him, he had come back to show Taehyun that his untouchable empire was made of glass. "Min-jae," Taehyun said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "Clear the kitchen. Lock the exits. And find out which one of our loyal staff let a dead man walk through the back door." He then looked back at Seo-yeol. The girl who had nothing had just handed him the most valuable secret in Seoul. The ghost of 15 years was back, and the war for the dragon's throne had just begun. Taehyun felt the world tilt as the girl's words sank in. The lightning bolt scar. The blue stone. These weren't just the marks of a partner, they were the marks of his own blood. The shadow man wasn't Junho. The description Seo-yeol provided was far more intimate, far more devastating. It was a description of Kang Ji-hoon, Taehyun's older brother. A decade ago, the syndicate had demanded a sacrifice to settle a bloody internal feud. Taehyun had been the one chosen to pull the trigger, to purge the weakness from the family line. He had stood on that rain-slicked pier, watched his brother's car ignite and tumble into the black abyss of the Han River. He had lived with that ghost every night, convincing himself the murder was the price of his throne. But as Seo-yeol spoke of the man's empty eyes and the way he rubbed his blue-stoned ring, Taehyun realized the abyss had spit his brother back out. "He told me the dragon was finally ready to sleep," Seo-yeol whispered, her eyes darting to the heavy gold chain on Taehyun's chest. He said brothers should share everything, even the end. Taehyun's breath hitched. Share everything. It was the motto they had whispered as children huddling in the slums, long before they became monsters. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Ji-hoon wasn't just back for the empire, he was back for a twisted version of a family reunion. He had spent 10 years transforming his resentment into a poison, waiting for the perfect moment to serve it to the brother who had betrayed him. Boss? Min Jae's voice was strained, his hand trembling slightly on his holster. If Ji-hoon is alive. If he's the one who was in the kitchen. Then every wall I built is useless, Taehyun finished, his voice a hollow rasp. He looked at the girl, seeing the reflection of his own childhood poverty in her tattered clothes. Ji-hoon had used her. He had chosen the most invisible, most vulnerable creature in the city to deliver his death sentence, knowing that Taehyun's arrogance would never allow him to look at a beggar twice. The golden cage had been breached not by a rival army, but by a ghost who knew exactly where the keys were hidden. Taehyun looked at the plate of food, then at the girl, and finally at his men. The betrayal tasted more bitter than any poison. His brother was alive, he was in the city, and he was starting his war by targeting the only thing Taehyun had left, his life. Taehyun did not move, but the air around him seemed to thicken with a lethal chill. He didn't look toward the door where his brother might be lurking, nor at the girl who had brought the warning. Instead, his eyes slid slowly, like a predator's, toward the two men standing closest to him. The inner circle. In his world, these were the only men allowed to see him without a weapon in their hands. They were his shields, his shadows, the gatekeepers of his life. But as the revelation of Ji-hoon's return settled into the room, the loyalty that had felt like solid rock just moments ago began to crumble into sand. He looked first at Park Min-jae. The muscular bodyguard was breathing too shallowly, his eyes fixed on the girl with a strange, frantic intensity. Min-jae had been with Taehyun for 8 years. He knew the kitchen staff. He knew the secret service entrance. He knew exactly what time the boss would lift his fork. Was that sweat on Min-jae's brow, or just the humidity of the rain? Then, his gaze drifted to Choi Do-yoon. Do-yoon was calm, too calm. He hadn't flinched when the girl screamed. He stood slightly behind Taehyun's right shoulder, the perfect blind spot. If Ji-hoon had truly been in the kitchen, he wouldn't have gotten past the censors and the guards without a code. A code only the inner circle possessed. Min-jae, Taehyun said, his voice a low, vibrating thread of silk. You were in charge of the sweep tonight. You told me the perimeter was clean. It was, boss, Min-jae stammered, his hand twitching near his earpiece. I checked the logs myself. No one entered who wasn't on the list. And yet, Taehyun whispered, finally turning his head to look Min-jae in the eye, a dead man walked through my house. A man who shares my blood. A man who knew exactly which dish I would order. He watched the micro-expressions on their faces. In the high-stakes game of the Korean underground, a second's delay in an answer was a confession. He saw Do-yoon's hand tighten imperceptibly on the back of his chair. He saw Min-jae's eyes dart toward the security cameras. The silence was deafening. Taehyun realized with a sickening jolt that he was sitting in the middle of a trap. The golden cage wasn't just the restaurant, it was the very men he paid to protect him. One of them had opened the door for his brother. One of them was waiting for him to drop dead from the first bite so they could usher in a new king. He was trapped between a ghost at the door and a traitor at his back. And the only person in the room who wasn't lying to him was the starving girl in rags, clutching a sack of poisoned leftovers. Taehyun's eyes dropped from his trembling lieutenants to the rough, stained burlap sack clutched in Seo-yeol's small hands. The air in the room grew heavy with the smell of wet earth and something metallic, something wrong. You said he gave you a gift, Taehyun said, his voice sounding hollow against the marble walls. Is that what's in there? Seo-yeol nodded, her small frame shuddering as she lowered the sack to the pristine floor. The heavy thud it made seemed to echo the heartbeat of everyone in the room. With shaking fingers, she pulled back the coarse fabric. Inside weren't just scraps. There were several small wooden bowls, the kind used by street vendors, filled with the remains of the same saffron-tinted risotto and tender meat that sat on Taehyun's plate. But the food was graying, covered in a strange, iridescent film that shimmered like oil under the chandeliers. "He came to the market stalls yesterday," Seo-yeol whispered, her voice cracking. "He told the older boys he had extra food from a banquet. He said he wanted to see how much we liked it before he brought the rest tonight." She reached into the bag and pulled out a small, lifeless shape wrapped in a tattered cloth. It was a scrawny market dog, its body stiff, its muzzle stained with the same iridescent foam. "Bok-gu ate just one piece," she sobbed, cradling the small bundle. "He didn't even have time to whimper. He just went to sleep." The shadow man watched him die. He smiled and checked his watch, writing something down in a little black book. He said that dosage was perfect for a dragon. A wave of nausea hit Taehyun. It wasn't just an assassination, it was a cold, scientific trial. Ji-hoon hadn't just used the invisible children of Seoul as messengers, he had used them as lab rats. He had murdered an innocent animal and risked the lives of starving orphans just to calibrate the exact second Taehyun's heart would stop beating. Taehyun looked at the plate of food before him, then back at the dead dog in the girl's arms. The golden cage had never felt more like a tomb. His own brother had reached out from the grave to slaughter the innocent just to ensure his revenge was precise. The boss felt a tectonic shift within himself. For years, he had operated under the belief that power was the only thing that mattered. But looking at Seo-yeol, who had carried the proof of a murder through the rain and passed a dozen guns just to save a stranger, Taehyun realized he had been wrong. The true power in the room wasn't in his gold chain or his bodyguard's pistols. It was in the burlap sack of a girl who refused to let another soul go to sleep. The iridescent film on the food seemed to blur before Taehyun's eyes as a suffocating weight settled in his chest. He looked at the girl, really looked at her. Searching for something in the shape of her jaw or the curve of her brow that felt hauntingly familiar. "What was your father's name, Seo-yeol?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, dread pooling in his stomach like lead. Seo-yeol clutched the sack tighter, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Han Young-ho. He worked the night shifts at the Pier 7 warehouses. He used to say he was building the city, piece by piece." Taehyun felt the air leave his lungs. Pier 7. 4 years ago. The Great Purge he had ordered to solidify his control over the shipping lanes. He remembered the night vividly, the smell of diesel, the rattle of gunfire, and the collateral damage he had dismissed with a stroke of a pen. To him, it had been a strategic necessity to clear out the rival union. To the world, it was just another headline. But to the girl standing in front of him, it was the night the lights went out forever. "He didn't come home that morning," Seo-yeol continued, her voice small and fragile. "Mama said there was an accident, but the men in black suits told us to stop asking questions. Then Mama got sick from the grief and the cold." Taehyun closed his eyes. He saw the fire at the warehouse again, but this time, he didn't see the victory. He saw a man named Han Young-ho, a man with no gun, no gold chain, and no guards, caught in the crossfire of a war he never asked for. He saw a daughter waiting by a window for a father who was currently being erased from existence by Taehyun's own cleanup crew. The irony was a jagged blade in his heart. The very person he had orphaned, the life he had shattered to build his throne, was the only person who had walked through the rain to save him from his own blood. He had spent a decade convinced that his enemies were kings and ghosts, never realizing that his greatest debt was to the invisible people he had crushed under his feet. "I'm sorry," he rasped. The words felt pathetic, too small for the wreckage he had caused. Seo-yeol looked up, confused by the sudden crack in the dragon's voice. She didn't know he was the man who had turned her life into a ghost story. She only saw a man who was finally listening. Taehyun looked at his gold-ringed hands and saw only blood. He had built an empire on the ashes of families like hers, and now, that same empire was trying to swallow him whole. The debt was due, and it wouldn't be paid in gold. The silence of the restaurant didn't just break, it detonated. The front panoramic window, bulletproof glass designed to withstand a riot, spiderwebbed under the impact of a high-caliber round. The sound was like a whip cracking against the sky. Before the first shard of glass hit the marble floor, the lights flickered and died, plunging the golden cage into a terrifying, strobe-lit chaos. Down! Get the boss down! Do-yoon screamed, but his voice lacked the frantic edge of a protector, it sounded like a signal. Taehyun saw it in slow motion. Min-jae wasn't moving to cover him. He was moving toward the exit, his eyes locked on the shadows outside. And Do-yoon, the man who stood in his blind spot, had his weapon drawn. But it wasn't pointed at the door. It was leveled at Taehyun's chest. But Taehyun didn't look at the gun. He looked at Seo-yeol. The girl was frozen, her small hands still clutching the dead dog and the sack of poisoned food, her mouth open in a silent, paralyzed scream. She was a tiny, gray target in the middle of a crossfire of giants. In that split second, the dragon made a choice that defied 20 years of survival instinct. He didn't dive for his own weapon. He didn't flip the mahogany table for cover. Instead, Taehyun lunged forward, his heavy gold chain swinging wildly, and threw his entire body over the child. 2 rounds buried themselves into the heavy wood of the chair where Taehyun's head had been a second before. He slammed into the floor, his expensive suit shielding Seo-yeol's fragile frame from the rain of glass shards. He could feel her heart hammering like a trapped bird against his ribs. "Stay small," Taehyun hissed into her ear, his voice no longer the growl of a mobster, but the desperate command of a father. "Don't you dare move." A second volley of gunfire shredded the velvet curtains. From the darkness of the kitchen, a silhouette emerged, tall, lean, and moving with a terrifying, familiar grace. It was Ji-hoon. The older brother stepped into the dim light of the emergency lamps, a suppressed pistol in his hand, his eyes empty and cold as the river that had supposedly claimed him. "You always were soft for a tragedy, Taehyun," Ji-hoon's voice drifted through the smoke, dripping with venom. "You'd die for the daughter of a man you murdered? How poetic. How weak." Taehyun felt a sharp sting in his shoulder, a graze from a shattered fragment, but he didn't pull away. He tightened his grip on Seo-yeol, shielding her head with his hands. For the first time in his life, his pride didn't matter. The gold chain, the docks, the empire, it was all ash. The only thing that was real was the weight of this innocent life beneath him. "I'm not dying for a tragedy, Ji-hoon," Taehyun rasped, reaching blindly for the backup pistol strapped to his ankle while keeping his body firmly between the girl and the ghost. "I'm finally doing my job." The muzzle flash from Taehyun's ankle-holstered pistol lit up the dark room like a lightning strike. He didn't fire to kill, not yet. He fired to suppress, the rounds thudding into the mahogany table and forcing Ji-hoon back into the shadows of the kitchen. "Min-jae. Do-yoon." Taehyun's voice roared over the ringing in his ears. "Choose your side. Now." The hesitation lasted only a heartbeat. Min-jae, seeing the dragon rise not as a victim but as a shield, turned his weapon toward the kitchen. But Do-yoon remained frozen, his gun still wavering between his old master and the ghost in the doorway. He was the mole. The realization didn't bring Taehyun anger, only a cold, surgical clarity. With a single, fluid motion, Taehyun fired. Do-yoon collapsed without a word, the traitor's blood staining the white linen tablecloth he had helped set an hour before. "Go, Min-jae. Secure the perimeter." Taehyun commanded. He didn't wait for a response. He scooped Seo-yeol into his arms, feeling her small hands lock around his neck in a grip of pure survival. He didn't head for the armored limousine. Instead, he walked toward the back exit, passing the untouched, poisoned feast. He reached up and unlatched the heavy gold chain from his neck, dropping it onto the floor. The dragon was dead. The man who remained didn't need a golden collar to prove his worth. They stepped out into the soul rain. The city lights blurred into a kaleidoscope of neon blues and grays. Behind them, the Black Dragon restaurant was a tomb of glass and shattered egos. Ahead of them lay the vast, breathing city of invisible people. Where are we going? Seo Yul whispered, her voice muffled against his damp suit jacket. Taehyun looked down at her. The dirt was still on her face, but the terror in her eyes had been replaced by a flickering spark of trust. He had spent 20 years cleaning up messes for the syndicate. Now, he would spend the rest of his life cleaning up the city for her. He would find his brother, he would dismantle the rot in his organization, and he would build something that didn't require a cage to protect. We're going to find a place where you don't have to carry a sack of scraps, Taehyun said softly. He didn't look back at the empire he was leaving behind. He walked into the night, a fallen king becoming a guardian. The rain washed the blood from his hands, and for the first time in his life, Kang Taehyun breathed the air of a free man. The war wasn't over, but the motive had changed. He wasn't fighting for a throne anymore, he was fighting for a daughter.